Pittsburgh. It's a city known for many things. Its steel industry that's been gone since the 70s, putting french fries on sandwiches, and its sports teams that used to be good. However, if you were to turn back the clock a bit, Pittsburgh was also famous for its trolleys. In the first half of the 20th century, Pittsburgh had one of the largest streetcar systems in the country. But today, there's not a single trolley to be found. So what happened to Pittsburgh's trolleys, and could they ever come back? Before Pittsburgh was the city of steel, it was an important outpost in what was then America's frontier. Its position at the convergence of the Ohio, Allegheny, and Monongahela rivers made shipping goods out of the city and into the rest of the Mississippi Valley an easy task. Its close proximity to the port cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia was also a boon, as it made it easier for European immigrants to arrive and settle in the region, especially after the construction of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1852. Finally, Pittsburgh is located in an iron and coal-rich region, which allowed it to eventually become America's leading steel producer. Most of the steel mills stuck by the rivers so they could easily ship their product down the Ohio. However, Pittsburgh is extremely hilly, and transportation anywhere outside of the riverbanks was extremely difficult. A frequent form of transport back in the day was the omnibus, a horse-carried carriage that could fit up to 12 people inside. However, in Pittsburgh's muddy cobblestone streets, these omnibuses were very uncomfortable and frequently got stuck in mud. Inspired by developments in major cities in the East Coast, construction on rail-bound horse cars began in 1859. Much like the omnibus, these cars were pulled by two horses, but instead of having to drive over worn-down wooden roads, they could smoothly run through tracks, making the ride more comfortable and consistent. By 1869, only 10 years after the construction of the first horse car track, there were already several competing businesses racing to build more lines. These horse cars allowed people to move around town in a safe and convenient way. However, they still had a few problems. For one, horses left their manure everywhere, which attracted flies and helped spread diseases. Secondly, while they were good on relatively flat ground, the horses had trouble climbing up very steep hills. For the residents of Coal Hill, this was a problem. Coal Hill, today known as Mount Washington, is located right by the Ohio and Monongahela rivers, making it prime real estate for immigrant workers wanting to live near their jobs in the riverside factories. However, the climb up and down the hill was an excruciating one, and for horses it was downright impossible, even with rails. In response to the demand for transport to and from Coal Hill, the inclines were born. The inclines are a type of funicular railway. They are pulled by a cable underneath them, with the descending car serving as a counterbalance to the ascending car. As one car goes up, it pulls the other one down. Look at it go! Pittsburgh's first incline opened in May of 1870, connecting Carson Street by the river to Grandview Avenue atop the hill. The incline was a quick success, registering over 200,000 passengers in its first year of operation, and at their peak, there were a total of 14 inclines scattered across the city. By the turn of the century, Pittsburgh had become a major city. Immigrants from Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe rolled in daily, seeking a new life in Pittsburgh. Steel mills and blast furnaces dotted the landscape, covering the sky with gray-colored smoke of progress. Barges of coal and iron floated down the Mon and Allegheny, as Pittsburgh steel and plate glass was put on trains to be sent throughout the country. As Pittsburgh rapidly grew, so too did demand for faster and more efficient ways of transportation. Around that time, the electric streetcar was invented. It was easy to convert the horse car lines into electric trolley lines, as all that was needed was an overhead cable to pass a current into the trolley's motor. In 1889, the first trolley line was electrified in Pittsburgh, and soon after, investors were in a frenzy to electrify more and more trolley lines. Several new competing companies emerged, and in the years between 1891 and 1800, over 300 new miles of electrified track was built in the Pittsburgh area. This frenzied construction of new tracks led to some problems, however. Several rival companies now controlled Pittsburgh's transit system. This meant they used different cars, different fares, and quite often, several parallel roads right next to each other had competing trolley lines running through them. What started happening is that the larger trolley companies, or those with wealthier owners, began to lease the cars and rails owned by other companies. This meant that while the smaller companies still owned the tracks and the trolleys that ran on them, they were operated by the larger company. From this process of leasing and mortgaging railways, three main companies emerged: the Consolidated Traction Company, the United Traction Company, and the Southern Traction Company. In the turn of the century, these three companies owned most of Pittsburgh's trolley system, but that too was about to change. In 1900, a Philadelphia-based holdings company, unimaginatively called the Philadelphia Company, acquired Southern Traction, soon after renaming it the Pittsburgh Railways Company. In 1901, it signed lease agreements with United Traction and Consolidated Traction, and on December 31st, 1901, Pittsburgh's first unified streetcar system was born. As Pittsburgh's trolley network expanded, people followed it, choosing to settle and build their homes near to the lines for convenient access. But homes and small businesses weren't the only things built near the streetcar lines. At the time, amusement parks were common investments for street railway companies, increasing their profits through park tickets and trolley fares from the park's enthusiastic visitors. In 1898, the Monongahela Street Railway Company, one of Consolidated Traction's underliers, acquired a plot of land in West Mifflin, right at the end of their line, with plans to build a theme park at the location. In May of the following year, Kennywood Park opened to the public, to major success. To this day, Kennywood remains a major Pittsburgh institution, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. While on the outside, Pittsburgh's streetcar network seemed like one big unified thing, it was really a Byzantine mess of leases, mortgages, and never-ending contracts. In 1910, consulting engineer Bion J. Arnold released the report on the Pittsburgh transportation problem. Arnold's comprehensive report upon the transportation problem of the Pittsburgh district identified several issues with the system, but pointed to one single thing as the main problem with the network: the way in which it was structured. In Arnold's words,
"The city has a street railway system which is a consolidation of many former independent and competing lines laid out according to the designs of the original promoters without regard to any general plan."
His solution was for the transportation network's organizational structure to be rebuilt from the ground up. He called on the Pittsburgh Railways Company to cancel all current leases with the underlying companies, to reorganize their properties, and give Pittsburgh's streetcar network a single, unified, cohesive structure. However, nothing much came of the report. No action was taken by the PRC, and it mostly continued operating the trolley system as it did before. By the late 1910s, Pittsburgh Railway System network stretched as far south as Washington and Roscoe, as far as Sewickley to the west, and Trafford to the east. Besides the Pittsburgh Railways Company, several independent streetcar companies still owned interurban trolley lines that connected with the PRC's lines outside of the city. West Penn Railways, the Butler Harmony and Butler Short lines, and Beaver Valley Traction all made up a system of interurban trolleys that helped connect the city of Pittsburgh to the neighboring towns surrounding it. As 1913 rolled into 1914, the Pittsburgh Railways Company continued going full steam ahead on track construction, even as it started going into debt. Then, war broke out in Europe. While America wouldn't join the war for another 3 years, the impact on the market was immediate. As the nation braced for conflict and young, able-bodied men started being sent off to military camps, labor was in such short supply that employers were bidding against each other for workers. This sudden labor shortage forced Pittsburgh Railways to increase its wages. The average wage, which was 30 cents in 1914, surged to 44 cents by 1918. The conflict also had an effect on the company's energy bills. The price of coal, which was now in high demand, surged because of the war. In a desperate attempt to save the company's finances, Pittsburgh Railways increased the downtown fare, but it was too little too late. In 1918, the Pittsburgh Railways Company declared bankruptcy. The company was put under a receivership. During this receivership, the Pittsburgh Railways Company, the Philadelphia Company, the the city of Pittsburgh and over 24 local municipalities signed an agreement. This agreement established a Traction Conference Board, a board which would manage the city's relationship with the local municipalities, as well as replace the several street cleaning, license, and car taxes with a single flat fee. In 1920, the company also raised its fares to 10 cents. These changes made the costs of operating such an expansive trolley network far more predictable, improved service in the small townships surrounding Pittsburgh, and drastically improved the company's financial health. In February of 1924, with most of its debts paid off, the Pittsburgh Railways Company was finally released from receivership. The 1920s were a time of change. In 1923, the Sierra Street horsecar line in the south side, one of the last surviving horsecar lines in the country, shut down. 1923 was also the year in which Pittsburgh Railways saw its peak number of riders, with 279.5 million people riding the trolley. In the 20s, cars really began to take off, with the number of automobiles in the US surging from 6.5 million in 1919 to 23 million in 1929. Buses, which were already beginning to show up before the war, also began to dig into the trolley's market share, forcing the PRC to open its first few bus lines. Then, the Great Depression hit. Pittsburgh Railways, which was doing quite well for itself at the end of the decade, suddenly entered crisis mode. The number of riders, which was already steadily decreasing, plummeted, falling to 138.6 million by 1933, a decrease of over 50% in only 10 years. The PRC's neighbors also weren't doing well, with the Butler Short Line shutting down in 1931. And to make things worse, automobile ridership continued increasing despite the economic downturn. Pittsburgh Railways made it so trolleys would only have one operator instead of two, both decreasing their operating costs and worsening the unemployment crisis. Even then, the PRC's profits nosedived. The Traction Conference Board agreement collapsed, with Pittsburgh Railways failing to make any of the required payments from the fourth quarter of 1930 onwards. In May of 1938, as a result of a major underlying company suit over bonds, the Pittsburgh Railways Company again entered receivership. During this second receivership, the PRC would finally attempt to reorganize its system and rid itself of the underlying companies. In November of 1938, the courts ordered that a plan for reorganization would have to be approved by the state's Public Service Commission. After several plans were submitted and rejected, in 1942, the Public Service Commission submitted its amended, revised plan to the court, and a lengthy court battle began between Pittsburgh Railways and the several underlying companies. While this was going on, another war had started in Europe. Perhaps surprisingly, the Second World War helped keep the trolley afloat. The need to ration oil for the war effort made it so less people drove their cars, and ridership soared. From 1941 to 42 alone, ridership of the trolley and bus system increased by 50 million, and by the end of the war, the PRC's revenue almost returned to pre-depression levels. However, as the war ended, the same old problems returned. The car continued its meteoric rise in popularity, and the development of a new diesel-powered bus with hydraulic transmission made it so buses could be operated at a cheaper operating cost than the trolley. In 1951, the Pittsburgh Railways Company finally ended its legal dispute with the underlying company's bondholders, with the underliers being liquidated. 6 years later, the SEC liquidated the Philadelphia Company, making Pittsburgh Railways its own freestanding, publicly traded company. However, it still faced trouble. After the war, the Pittsburgh Renaissance had started, a plan to rejuvenate the city and rid it of its horrendous industrial smoke problem. These mid-century urban planners, inspired by their colleagues throughout the country, overwhelmingly favored cars and buses over what they saw as the antiquated and unreliable streetcar, and as time went on, the city, the press, and the general public all turned against the trolley. One of the leading voices against Pittsburgh Railways during this time was city solicitor Ann X. Alpern. As ridership decreased, the company repeatedly tried to raise fares so it wouldn't go belly up, and every single time, Alpern brought litigation against it. Alpern said that trolleys are just uneconomical to operate, said that Pittsburgh Railways has no intention of staying in business, and that it should just disappear. In the 1950s, interurban service completely ended. West Penn Railways, which serviced most of the small townships east of Pittsburgh, shut down in 1952, and the PRC's lines to Washington and Charleroi were abandoned the year after. Starting in 1950, the Pittsburgh Railways Company would also begin seriously investing in replacing streetcars with buses. While it refused to fully shut down all of its trolley lines, Pittsburgh Railways began replacing the shorter ones with so-called feeder buses. Despite this, a decrease in ridership and road projects forced the company to further scale back trolley operations. When the Fort Pitt Bridge began construction in 1955 and the old Point Bridge was scheduled to be torn down, the State Public Utilities Commission refused to allow streetcars to run through it. This meant disaster for the trolleys of the West End, as the bridge was their only connection to the rest of the network. Construction of another bridge, this time across the Allegheny, signaled the end for the Aspinwall trolley, while road repavings and improvements forced the PRC to shut down the streetcar line to McKeesport and replace several lines in East Liberty and Squirrel Hill. During this time period, the urban planners carrying out the Pittsburgh Renaissance really wanted Pittsburgh's transit system to be operated by a single central transit authority and not a private company like Pittsburgh Railways. In their eyes, Pittsburgh Railways was unfit to operate Pittsburgh's transit system, as it had either been in receivership or at the edge of bankruptcy since the First World War. In 1956, the state legislature passed a bill allowing the establishment of port authorities. These authorities would be allowed to operate ferries, docks, and ship repair yards, and were also given the power of eminent domain. The Port Authority of Allegheny County was established in 1958, and in the following year, the state legislature amended its previous act to give port authorities the power to operate mass transit systems. Allegheny County now had the power to seize the Pittsburgh Railways Company's transit system, and 5 years later, it did just that. On February 28, 1964, the Port Authority of Allegheny County filed a petition to seize Pittsburgh Railways' trolleys, buses, and tracks. The company lashed back, claiming that the authority was acting irresponsibly, as it had only given the company 48 hours of notice, but there was nothing it could do. After fighting the Port Authority in court, it managed to secure a settlement of $16.5 million, far more than the original $3.75 million promised, but the bulk of its system was gone for good. The Pittsburgh Railways Company was forced to leave public transit behind, and the Port Authority of Allegheny County now had full control of Pittsburgh's public transportation. Shortly after taking control of Pittsburgh's public transit system, the Port Authority launched a concerted operation to replace the last remaining trolleys with buses. The North Side's trolleys finished being replaced in 1966, followed by the East End in 1967. By the end of 1971, only a handful of trolley lines remained in operation, all of which were in the South Hills and needed to go through a private right-of-way. During the same period of rapid conversions to buses, the Port Authority decided to experiment in new methods of rapid transit. Instead of landing on a more traditional method of transport, it landed on the Skybus. Developed by local Westinghouse Electric, the Skybus was labeled by its supporters as a revolutionary new method of intermediate capacity transportation. Fully automated, the Skybus had no drivers, something that was completely unheard of in the 60s. Unlike the trolley, it had rubber tires that would run on a concrete track, which would allow it to climb steeper grades than the trolley. And unlike the other buses running around town, it wouldn't have to compete with cars for the road. It originally was meant to only replace the last few remaining trolley lines, connecting downtown to the then-new South Hills Village shopping center. But the Port Authority had even more ambitious plans. This was the Port Authority's master plan for Pittsburgh's public transit. Through a series of tunnels and bridges, the Skybus would weave through Pittsburgh's hilly landscape, and finally give the town the rapid transit it deserved. This massive undertaking would have been built in several stages. The first stage would have seen the construction of a line down the South Hills to the county airport, and another line cutting straight through the city, ending in Monroeville. The promised Skybus to the South Hills Village was only part of the second stage, along with the North Hills line. The third stage included the Ohio River line, which would connect to a planned sports stadium in the north side, as well as the Oakland line, which would have mostly gone underground right below Forbes Avenue. Finally, the fourth and fifth stages would have extended a few of the existing lines, as well as creating 3 short and stubby routes to Carnegie, Etna, and Rankin. This plan gave no time frame for construction, but it did give estimated costs and somewhat detailed maps and measurements for each line, for both skybus as well as light rail construction. However, this plan would face stiff opposition. The Port Authority relented, opting to adopt an early action program before examining the rest of the skybus network. This program would see the construction of only the South Hills Village line and 2 busways in parts of the planned Monroeville and County Airport skybus lines. Even then, this plan would still face challenges. While federal funds for the South Hills Village line were secured in 1971, the skybus would meet fierce opposition from the city and other public figures, such as Mayor Pete Flaherty and Pennsylvania Governor Milton Shapp. They argued that the few advantages the skybus had were heavily outweighed by its disadvantages, and instead proposed a light rail system to replace the old trolleys. In 1975, Governor Shapp blocked all funding for the skybus, and the following year, a federally mandated study released its findings, showing that a light rail transit system, or LRT, would be more cost-effective and attract more patrons than a skybus system. With the skybus dead, work began on replacing Pittsburgh's last remaining trolleys with light rail. On July 7th, 1985, the downtown light rail subway opened, and the last trolley rolled down the Golden Triangle, marking the end of an era. So what's happened to Pittsburgh's transit system since then? Well, the light rail, or the T, is still running. Plans for an extension into Squirrel Hill and Oakland showed up in the 90s, but those were eventually shot down. In 2012, the T extended into the north side, with 2 stations built next to PNC Park and... Heinz Field. The 2 busways from the skybus's early action program were built, though the south busway ends in Overbrook instead of Library. A west busway was also built from Carson Street to Carnegie, while construction has begun on a bus rapid transit system to Oakland and the East End. So what did happen to Pittsburgh's trolleys? Well, they were replaced by buses. Could the trolleys ever come back? Well, probably not. In 2021, the Port Authority, now called the PRT, released its plan for the next 25 years, and streetcars were nowhere to be seen. For all its problems, the busway system works fine the way it is, and the demand for streetcars, or even a citywide T network, just isn't where it needs to be to justify spending millions of dollars on a new track. So, it looks like the trolley's time is over. And honestly, I think that's a real shame. If you were to talk to anyone that was alive back before the trolley stopped in their tracks, they'll see how the trolley was convenient to use and charming. Meanwhile, if you were to ask the average Pittsburgher nowadays what they think about the bus system, they won't have nice things to say. That may just be nostalgia, but in this day and age of rising temperatures and wild weather, replacing diesel-powered, rubber-burning buses with clean electric trolleys seems like a no-brainer. So, while the trolley may be gone, it still remains an important part of Pittsburgh's cultural identity and can give us a look at what the future may hold.